So to one and all, a very warm welcome from all over Africa and beyond. Lovely to have you with us once again. Our first talk this evening is by Dr. David Roy. David is from the UK Centre for Ecology and Hydrology, where he has since 2010 been the head of the Biological Records Centre. David is involved in research in the fields of biodiversity monitoring, biological recording, citizen science, and the biological impacts of climate change. Has been the lead for the Centre for Ecology and Hydrology on the contribution to the United Kingdom butterfly monitoring scheme. And I'm sure that is the basis, David, of your presentation this evening. But monitoring of butterflies is growing in popularity, not only in the UK, but across Europe. And this has blossomed from the first transect scheme that started over 40 years ago in the UK. And David's going to share with us latest developments in monitoring butterflies across Europe. He's going to talk this evening about approaches to monitoring butterflies, the latest trends and indicators, and also linkages to a European pollinator monitoring scheme. David, it's wonderful to have you with us on this platform this evening, and we look forward very much to hearing what you have to share with us. Over to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for that very nice introduction. Great. Yeah, so I'm going to, well, thanks for the invite again. And I spoke to the Citizen Science Hour probably a couple of months ago about the work of the Biological Records Centre, but I'm going to talk about some other things I'm involved in, which is around butterfly monitoring and particularly what's happening within Europe. So just a bit of context in terms of the European butterfly fauna. So we have the auspicious start by Linnaeus, have named many species in the mid-1700s, and this figure shows the species described in Europe, and it's now stabilized around almost 500 species. And it's quite surprising that the molecular revolution hasn't really changed that massively. There's been a few splits and new species, but we're around about 500 species. And this is based on the definition of Europe that doesn't include Turkey. So if you add in Turkey, you get several other species that come from further east than Europe. And in terms of the global picture, there's around 6,000 species described globally, which is out of the total of 19,000 overall for Lepidoptera. And the European fauna, as I say, is around 500 species. Most groups represented, but some differences in terms of the makeup of the European fauna compared to the global situation. We don't have any sort of tropical heliconius type butterflies, unfortunately. But what we do have, as we already had mentioned, the spectacular small tortoiseshell. So we have lots of nymphalids. It was interesting to hear the comment about the peacock, which, yeah, we're very familiar of seeing, and you sort of forget the majesty and the beauty of some of these species that you see all the time. But I agree, it's an amazing species. We have quite a lot of lysinids, the blues, that so this is a species I did some work on during my PhD, the Adonis blue, which is a fantastic, vibrant species that we see on our chalk grasslands across southern England. And in terms of Europe, I guess one of the most notable species is the Parnassus Apollo, or the mountain Apollo, which is a fantastic thing to see in the wider Europe. And within our fauna in Europe, we have, I think, I'm not sure if this is the only one, but relatively few introduced species. But we would like to thank South Africa for contributing the geranium bronze to the European continent. It was brought across on potted geranium plants, we believe. It's now reasonably well established in parts of the Mediterranean, around urban areas where there's lots of geraniums, but really nice thing to see. So this is a brief introduction to the European fauna. So I'm really going to focus on the monitoring situation within Europe. So I suppose the question to start with is why do we take an interest in monitoring butterflies? I'm sure I don't need to say this to a very familiar audience, an audience who's very familiar with this topic as you are, but it's really central to really understanding the state of the environment and how we respond to it, what we try and protect, the sorts of habitats we try and restore, the sorts of way we treat the land, etc. So I think it's for people who need to make decisions on this, we need good evidence. And often we don't know the use to which data is going to be put. The butterfly monitoring scheme in the UK starting in the 70s, for example, climate change wasn't a particular issue that people were concerned with, but that's been one of the major uses of the data to understand how biodiversity in general responds to climate change in terms of phenological changes, changes in distribution, changes in numbers, evolutionary changes, etc. So huge contribution to the global understanding of those sorts of issues. And the other reason we monitor is because it's fun, it engages people, it involves people in the natural environment to then care about the status and what's happening to wildlife and the things around them. So the element of citizen science within monitoring is incredibly important, I think, because people are invested in the answer by being involved in the data collection. And if you take the final point in the slide, if you take an economic view, there's some good evidence when people have reviewed the benefits in terms of our ability to do research in environmental issues and make decisions and societal benefits. There's some good evidence that monitoring isn't without its costs, but it can more than pay for itself. There's a nice paper using pollinators as an example shown there. So I'm going to spend a bit of time talking about the ways that we monitor butterflies in Europe, and I'm sure elsewhere in the world. So from opportunistic sightings through to more structured approaches and ways such as capture, mark, recapture. Actually, I'm not going to say much about capture, mark, recapture, but that's obviously a very detailed way of monitoring butterfly populations, but very labor intensive. So I'm really going to focus on the other methods. So the first of which is opportunistic sightings or atlas data or biological records. Lots of ways of describing this activity, but really it's people reporting sightings of butterflies. And the data that accumulates has really come from people doing it for their own interest. There's no rules, no conditions about doing this. The ways that people can submit now is increasing rapidly through social media, through apps, websites, etc. And is a big citizen science activity. A lot of photographers like to get involved to show off their expertise. But the data is what comes together is a mix of individual sightings, someone's seen something and just want to report it, versus some very expert people who visit sites, make complete lists. It's a very rich data amongst it. And it's really good for mapping, obviously, and it's a sort of first step to understand the butterfly fauna, and has been used for lots of science work, particularly understanding some really dramatic changes in range of species in response to climate change, for example. And there's now some good methods that we can use on this data to understand trends through time as data gets accumulated over several years. There are some statistical methods to extract trends from that data in terms of trends in occupancy, so effectively presence, the range, the sort of range extent of species as a measure of change. And this map on the right shows an accumulation of sort of accessible records for Europe through GBIF, including iNaturalist data, and observational.org, which is a popular system in Europe, a sort of Dutch system. And what it shows is a sort of a gradient in number of records, more in the north and west of Europe, the UK or the Britain and Ireland, the Netherlands, Denmark, bits of Scandinavia, where there's lots of recording going on. but it thins out as you go further south, and particularly southeast in Europe. And I haven't got a figure to show it or a map to show it, but if you look at the diversity of butterflies in Europe, the gradient goes the other way. So we have many more species in the Mediterranean, moving towards Turkey, the south and east, and in the east of Europe. So we have more data where there's fewer butterflies, which is a slight problem in terms of getting a comprehensive picture of what's happening to butterflies in Europe. But this is increasing rapidly, the collection of this sort of data across Europe. This is illustrated from a summary of that data through time, the data that's available through GBIF and other sources. And what we see is a general increase, particularly the online systems, iNaturalist and observation.org. And within the pink bars, the other GBIF sources, there will be lots of national online systems and portals that feed into GBIF within different countries of Europe. But there's typically a lag in that data getting through the system. So although the last few years have smaller numbers, I'm sure once the data comes through, they will outstrip the numbers in previous years. So that's the opportunistic data, incredibly valuable in all sorts of ways. The second way we monitor is butterfly transects, which are illustrated here. They started, the earliest one really was in 1973 in a place called Monkswood, where I used to be based, in Cambridgeshire in the UK, for those who know the UK. A national nature reserve. Used to be very good for butterflies until it was protected as a nature reserve, and then it seemed to have lost all its interesting butterflies as the management wasn't really appropriate, and pressures of deer grazing, for example, affected the woodland flora. But anyway, this was the first site that was set up, and what's shown on the map is the route. So it's a line transect through the wood that's recorded regularly, ideally every week during the summer months, when the weather's sufficient. And this picture is the person who started the scheme in the UK, Ernie Pollard, walking one of the transects in the 70s. And remarkably, I'm not sure if he's still walking, but this shows him walking actually a different transect in 2016 when we celebrated our 40th anniversary of the scheme, formal 40th anniversary. So incredible contribution to butterfly monitoring through Ernie Pollard. And this is another picture of a famous butterfly person in Europe, Constanti Stefanescu, who runs the scheme in Catalonia. Amazing butterfly person, and has done a huge amount of work on the painted lady migrations. You might have seen some news about that in the last few weeks. That would make another fantastic talk if you can persuade him to talk to you. I'm sure he would. So he set up the butterfly scheme in Catalonia. And butterfly transects have the advantage that, again, they're relatively easy to do. I say easy, you need to know your butterflies, which can be a bit of a barrier, but it's a nice walk in sunny weather. And the advantage of this method is it's got a bit more standardization to it. So it's a regular route that's fixed, complete lists of numbers of individuals seen. Again, is typically citizen science based in Europe, but you have to be relatively expert in terms of knowing your species, being able to identify them as you're walking. And there's lots of expertise in how to analyze this data, and therefore it's used to report trends nationally and at European level, and has been shown to be a very sensitive measure of change. So in some ways, it's a sort of gold standard approach to monitoring butterflies in Europe. And it's grown in popularity, as illustrated by this figure here. There's quite a lot going on here. I'll start with a map on the right, which is a summary of the number of transects that are operating across Europe. So the colours, the red of the colour is more transects. So there's lots going on in the UK, lots going on in the Netherlands, Catalonia, which is in this part of Spain, northwestern Spain, if you know that part of the world. Not a really nice place to be. And Finland, Finland's got a regular scheme, and schemes are starting in Sweden, in Germany. Switzerland's interesting that it has a paid scheme, which has a very consistent effort across the country, while it's one single colour. Very expensive to run with professional surveyors, but very, very effective. So again, it shows a bias towards North and West Europe, again, where we've got more transects going on, where there's fewer butterflies. But we're starting to establish schemes in Italy, in Hungary, and in the far southwest of Europe, in Cyprus, for example. But it's a struggle, I think, because it takes a lot of commitment to walk transects, etc. And the bar charts show the number of transects walked year by year, so that's increasing. And the yellow shows the number of schemes in countries. So there's now 22 schemes across Europe, so growing rapidly. And that benefited from some funding by the European Union over the last couple of years. There's a project called ABLE, which has allowed us to help develop schemes across Europe by providing some of the key things to help get the scheme underway, which is a guide in multiple languages, regional identification guides, and some nice ways of presenting the activity through this sort of infographic. So, and what that allows us to do by having these monitoring schemes in different parts of Europe, we can then get a good assessment of the status of individual butterfly species and what they're doing in different parts of Europe. So this figure shows the sorts of trends that we're now producing for Europe for the wall butterfly, the Lasiomata megera, which has been gone through. It's an interesting story that's been lost from lots of places in North and Central Europe, but at the same time it's still expanding northwards through climate change. And no one's really got to the bottom of why it's declining. There's lots of hypotheses about what might be going on, but the trend figure shows that there's a similar pattern of decline occurring in different parts of Europe. Each colour represents a different scheme, monitoring scheme in Europe. So we can produce individual species trends, and we can also produce, we can combine these trends into indicators. The one that we've been producing for longest is the European Grassland indicator. So these are very important for raising awareness and linking into policies at the European level and member state level. So the Grassland indicator combines 17 species that have been identified as being characteristic of grassland. It includes some very specialist species, but also some relatively widespread species. So it's hopefully gives a combined picture of what's going on. And what we can do is combine those individual species trends into indicators, as illustrated here, produced for the European Union countries, but also the wider Europe, which includes Switzerland, and the UK now, for example, after we've left Europe. And the two show a similar picture of decline, around 30% over the period the indicator's been created, 1990 to 2017, 2018, the latest results. And the reasons for this are twofold, really. One is the intensification of land use. So in parts of Europe, particularly northern Europe, it's grasslands being treated with fertilizers to make them more palatable for feeding livestock, for example. But in the south of Europe, where grassland butterflies have favoured traditional management techniques, often in montane alpine situations, there's an issue with abandonment. It's just hard work farming these places, so the older generations are giving up. So these grassland habitats are not being as managed as actively and becoming more scrubbed up through succession, which is affecting the grassland butterflies. So, transects are really important in Europe, but they only give us a results for a subset of species. So we've got 496 species in Europe of butterflies. We're only able to report on 167 of those through the Transect data. And most of those are species we aren't really concerned about in terms of red list conservation categories. They're in the least concern category. So we're not really monitoring our really vulnerable threatened species across Europe. That's partly because we're not covering the south and east of Europe, but also because transects are hard to do. They take a lot of effort, and some of these species are in remote places. So we have this sort of issue that we have this sort of illustrated by this pyramid of numbers. We have most people producing incidental records, sightings, but that data's got relatively low information content because it's relatively unstructured, very diverse. And we have transects, which are very structured, repeat visits, fixed sites, systematic approaches, but we have fewer people doing them because it's hard work. It takes a lot of commitment, a lot of expertise. So what we've been trying to also do in Europe is think whether there's a middle way to monitor butterflies that sort of somewhere between the two. So we are developing and promoting point time counts, where again, relatively easy to do in suitable weather, but it has some standardization to it compared to general sightings data. So we know the time of effort going into the recording, and we also know the area covered, and also can have a complete list with numbers. And this has proven it successful engaging the wider public through citizen science. An initiative from the UK's butterfly conservation, a big butterfly count, gets lots of publicity, sort of supported by major supermarkets, etc., where people can contribute anywhere, anytime. And there's been some nice analysis of this data shown on the graph on the right, where trends from this mass citizen science project, when you compare it with the butterfly monitoring scheme data, which is much more structured, each point on here is an individual species, and the solid line is a one-to-one line where the trend is equal from the different methods. We see a strong correlation between the two methods. So this sort of mass citizen science scheme can produce similar results to the more structured butterfly monitoring scheme for the common and widespread species. So it has benefit for the common and widespread species, engaging people. We also think this time counts can be very useful in remote areas that people can't get to very often. So it could be valuable for montane species or inaccessible places where people don't visit regularly to enable a transect. So the way and the other advantage of these sorts of approaches, they can be linked to mobile applications that allow the data to be captured more easily for people in the field. So the phone can track routes, so we know the area covered and can set timers to fix the time to 15 minutes. So we produced this butterfly count app for Europe, and we're trying to think about ways that we could maybe expand this more widely to other places. So two more slides. So the summary of where we are within Europe. So biodiversity monitoring has proven to be hugely valuable for all sorts of research applications and to direct conservation effort. Citizen science based is hugely cost effective, and I'm really keen to emphasize that it engages people, which is an equally important benefit. 15-minute counts is where we're putting quite a lot of effort, and we really do need to count numbers of individuals. Certainly in Europe, to get a good picture, we need to move beyond the sightings. So my final slide was why I'm really keen to talk to different people around the world. I've been working with Butterfly Conservation Europe, the Institute of Zoology, who produce a Living Planet Index, and the IUCN groups, specialist groups, to think about whether we can start to build a global partnership around butterfly monitoring. So we're trying to attract funding to make real progress on this but in the meantime, we're trying to compile a list of those organizations who are running schemes across the world, try and build relationships with them and think about whether we could share data for common goals. And we're trying to plan a conference in 2022 to bring people together and ultimately share tools to really get wider coverage of monitoring, so we can understand issues of insect declines and what's really happening, because we've got a very biased view about what's happening to insects currently. So thanks for listening, and yeah, thanks to all the people who've worked with me on this topic. It's a very collective effort within Europe. Thank you very much.
David, thank you very much for a very interesting presentation. And I think the concept that you shared with us on the last slide of a global partnership of butterfly monitoring or schemes, should I say, is I think that's a wonderful concept. I'm just going to look at some of the questions. There was one here regarding opportunistic data. Is there accounting for the same sighting being uploaded to multiple databases when collating the data?
No, I think, yeah, it's definitely an issue. There will be lots of duplication going on, but the analysis that people apply should deal with that. It sort of breaks it down to the sort of basic unit is an observation in a grid square with a date and a species, and then the sort of models work on that basic unit, so it sort of sorts of the duplication before the analysis approach. But I think researchers using this data need to be aware that there is a lot of duplication in these, you know, when things reach GBIF, for example, there's huge duplication going on.
I don't know whether there are any comments from the folk from LEPSOC Africa on the forum this evening. Jeremy, Steve, perhaps with regard to how we down in this part of the world could possibly contribute or get involved.
David, thanks very much for the talk. I think you know, I haven't really got any comments, but just very briefly to perhaps give you a bit of perspective of, you know, how things are happening in South Africa. Okay, firstly, we've got a lot more butterflies, and you know, we're more butterflies in the country than we have in Europe, but we've got a far less volunteers and people monitoring them. But you know, I think we've got an ever-increasing pool of photographers, people going out there and making lists. So you know, we're on our way. I think there is some progress being made, and I'll be very interested to you know, look at your talk in a bit more detail and see if we can pick up any important you know, guidelines. But thanks very much. No, I don't think there's you know, I think we're way behind you in many ways, but you know, I think particularly with LEPSOC, at least there is a bit of a focus on the rare and endangered Lepidoptera, and then with LepiMap, you know, we've got a more general view on the big picture, if you like. So, you know, I think we're not doing too badly, but certainly we've got a lot of work to do still.
Yeah, no, it's really impressive what's going on in South Africa. I visited a couple of years ago, and I met Les and a few other people. So yeah, I know a bit about what's going on. But yeah, I appreciate it's many more species and a fewer people in parts of the country to contribute. But the other point I meant to say is that yeah, you know, looking at countries where there's lots going on, it can be quite, well, not intimidating, but you think, well, how would he ever get there? But the BMS, the UK scheme started with 2 sites and just gradually grew, and that's happening in other parts of Europe. Once you get a sort of one or two sites and it's sort of a visible thing, it can sort of build momentum. So yeah, our experiences show that can happen.
What we noticed here was when Les and his team started LepiMap, blimey, 15 years ago now or more. You know, it started out as being, a lot of things happened at the same time. Digital cameras took off, I didn't plan it that way, but my first field guide came out at the same time, which
I have it on my shelves behind me, I think.
Hey, wonderful. And yeah, we all of a sudden got a lot of people who were new to the hobby. A lot of birders, a lot of plant fanciers, and so on came in. But one of the things that I'm going to ask a question about what's happening in Europe with this, because just recently, in recent years, we've had a thing called the caterpillar rearing group, which seems to have hit a what's the word I'm looking for? A chord, particularly amongst ladies. I mean, don't want to sound sexist, but it seems to be particularly popular amongst mums with kids. Is breeding caterpillars and finding. I've had ladies fight over caterpillars on butterfly. Well, I saw that one first. I'm breeding it, and it's just taking off crazily, and to the point where there's just simply keeping on top of what's happening can be difficult. But I think they've gone from, in Southern Africa, we've gone from something like only knowing something ridiculously small, like 5% of our life histories, and now we're heading towards 20%. Just purely from amateurs rearing caterpillars that they find in the wild. And I think, look, as Jeremy said, we've got a lot more species down here than you do certainly in England. But we also tend to think of Lepidoptera as only being papilionoidea. But of course, as Herman Staudy will tell you, that's only sort of 5% of the story. And the big problem was so many of the other superfamilies that were completely unknown, and people have been. I mean, I found new houseplant records in my garden here. People have discovered new species, incredible new range extensions as well. Just purely not because they're going out there photographing butterflies and moths in the wild, but because they're finding caterpillars and rearing them. Is there anything along that lines going on in Europe?
Yeah, that definitely is a sort of interesting, sort of breeding through species of Lepidoptera. There'll be big communities who are interested in that sort of thing across a range of groups, I think. So yeah, I think, and so that's from the sort of dedicated naturalists, and then there is, as you say, a lot of general interest in breeding through caterpillars into butterflies, and there's quite an active market in selling kits that children can buy. They're often painted ladies, I think, and I think there's in the Netherlands they do a lot of breeding through of whites and things, for example, that they give out kits. So yeah, I think anything to get people interested is fantastic.
Great. Thank you, Steve. Thanks for that. Thanks, Jeremy, for your inputs. David, a fascinating presentation. There's just one question that's come up. Are there monitoring programs for other pollinators such as bumblebees in the UK and Europe?
Yeah, when I was putting together this talk, I was initially going to talk about the wider pollinator work. So there are transect type schemes for bumblebees. There's one that in the UK has been running 10 years, and in the Netherlands, I think. So there's those sort of things. And there is a big project starting in Europe to develop a wider pollinator monitoring scheme for Europe, which would include pan traps, transects, and looking at other methods like malaise traps, light traps, etc. So it's definitely growing momentum and growing interest in wider pollinators now. But butterflies have the advantage, they sort of get people into the subject and then they can move on to other taxa. Yeah.
About 10 years ago, I was living in Eastern Gambia, so it's not South Africa, but it's different from the UK, and I ran my own transect there. It was a bit more loose than the transects that I'm doing in the UK. It's worth mentioning in that the Gambia has about 180 species. I saw 75 species during the year, and it's worth doing. It's very interesting. 50 to 70 species is manageable. You do have to know what you're looking for, and some genera amongst the Lycaenids, for example, you simply got to put down to simply the genus. But even for myself, I found it very interesting in just seeing what varied throughout the year, even in the rainy season, what stuck to particular types of habitats, sunspotting, perching, what have you. And it is hard in Africa. You've got a lot more species, and in the rainforest in Nigeria it'd be impossible because of the numbers, but it can be done, and I think it's something that's very worth doing, especially in Africa, where the seasonal variation from in West Africa, complete dry season to wet season is really worth looking at. So I encourage people to try.
Great, thanks very much, David. I hope that, as Jeremy said, your presentation is hopefully going to open up some dialogue and people chatting to one another about getting involved and partnering. So thank you very, very much indeed for your presentation.
Thank you.